We are back here now on the show to talk about what's been going on in the offseason, to kind of break up the monotony and just the grueling regiment of the offseason so far. This week was the official start of joint practices in and around the NFL, and some of the first training camp, joint practices already took place, going back to Sunday with the Los Angeles Rams and the Los Angeles Chargers sort of kicking off the festivities with having joint practices. Then yesterday we had the Lions and the New York Giants start their joint practices, and that one's been probably the most noteworthy of all the joint practices up until this point. Today we had the Dolphins and the Falcons going through a joint practice as well, and I think the rest will follow on Thursday with the Rams again having some more joint practices, this time with the Dallas Cowboys, and the Washington Commanders having one with the New York Jets. Usually, why there's so many already now coinciding with the start of preseason is because teams usually like to plan it out that way to lead into that preseason game and just get a little bit more of a competitive aspect, some more of those competitive juices flowing in some of their players, where now, you kind of have a good understanding of what training camp is. You're going through your usual routine. You might be living somewhere else for the time being in terms of going somewhere else for training camp, so it could get a little lackadaisical. You want to keep guys on their, toes, obviously, in such a time where a lot of these guys are fighting for positions, are fighting for roster spots, and it needs to be very competitive to do so. And how else would you do that by bringing on another team? And it's gotten pretty chippy in some of these instances, as it usually does, right? With the Detroit Lions and the New York Lions as well on Monday. They've gone in probably like 4 fights already throughout the 2 days that they've had joint practices, and they are one of the 30, or they're two of the 30 teams that are taking part in all of these joint practices. There's going to be a total of 22 this offseason, and the only teams that are not doing joint practices will be the Kansas City Chiefs and the Las Vegas Raiders in that same division. If they were to do it, you could probably guess that there would be a ton of fights between those two teams, just going back from last year as well. But with so many going on, and I think from, just my knowledge of joint practices, this might be one of the years that I've seen, basically everybody doing it. It usually feels like it's only a couple of teams taking part in it. Some teams that are familiar with each other, the head coaches are very familiar, former, on the same coaching staff or something like that. It usually, to me, it seems like it plays out that way, but now I feel like more teams are starting to see the benefit of it, even though, again, the biggest negative of the entire situation is that you get fights like the ones we see with the Lions and the Giants. And just going through some of those, the negative side of it, just going back to the first day, right off the bat, you had Jameson Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown getting into it with the Giants quarterbacks, Dane Belton and Andrew Phillips. Some shoving, some pushing, some hands in opposing teams' faces, and just big scrums right off the bat in some of these practices. And the biggest fight was actually involving the guy that you don't want to get touched or don't want to do anything. You don't want anything to do with them getting in a fight. Happened with Daniel Jones, and it happened actually in a, sort of sequence where the Giants were on offense. They were going through 11 and 11s, I want to say, and, they were running through it. They had pads on, obviously, throughout this practice, and the play prior to the start of this fight, some Detroit Lions player, some defender, actually hit Daniel Jones, hit his arm a little bit, and that drew the ire of Brian Dable, being upset that somebody touched his quarterback. That's, the unwritten rule. Unwritten, everybody knows that you're not supposed to touch the quarterback, but somebody hit Daniel Jones, not too hard, but, teams get, sensitive about that. That's the quarterback. They're paying a lot of money to Daniel Jones. Don't touch the quarterback, right? But somebody hit his arm. There was a big, fuss made about it from Brian Dable, as you would expect. The next play happens, and it was a run play. Some offensive linemen get tied up together, and Daniel Jones, right out of the gate, jumps into the middle of the fight, and that sparks a whole other, issue there with the fight going on, with your quarterback being right in the middle of it. Not what you want to see if you're the Giants, but that continued on into the next day. Today, the Giants having another joint practice with the Lions, and you saw some more fights. Malik Neighbors getting into it with Kirby Joseph. Pretty intense up until this point, and you don't want two of your best players potentially getting hurt by throwing punches or, just being in the middle of a scrum and getting hurt inadvertently, something like that. So that's really the biggest negative. But even with that being the case, more teams, it seems like, are starting to do it now. And it could be something that I don't think would be crazy to suggest as a potential alternative going forward to maybe some of these preseason games. And why I think of it like this is because, the big cloud looms over the NFL on the potential of there being 18 games in the near future. And the biggest reason around 18 games and how it all really got started was because Roger Goodell brought up the fact that he would like to see more regular season games over preseason games. He said that that was an ideal scenario that he would always decide to choose, a regular season game over a preseason game. And they already chopped the amount of preseason games down to 3. Some teams have 4 if you play in the Hall of Fame game, but they already cut it down years before when they added another regular season game. But now, with the potential again to add an 18th game, I think if they're trying to find a solution, it wouldn't surprise me if they decided to maybe not make joint practices necessary, but just encourage, I guess you could say, for the NFL to encourage a lot of these teams to hold these joint practices. And you could see more and more teams, have these joint practices throughout the duration of the offseason, maybe a little bit earlier with some more frequency to kind of get the same sense of having a preseason game there day in, day out potentially. Now, of course, it brings the negative side of it. You have guys that you don't really have too much control over, if that makes sense. If you're bringing in a team to your facility, to where you're staying for training camp, yeah, you might have some more control because the coaches are everywhere. You're kind of running through controlled scenarios and controlled, scrimmages or something like that. But again, there's still that weird aspect of having guys that you're not really knowing on a personal level. But you can't have 3 preseason games really as the main focal point of this. You can't have 3 preseason games and then also tack on 18 regular season games on top of that. I don't think it would work out with the offseason changes that they want to implement as well from the NFLPA. So something has to give, and it seems like the preseason is almost undoubtedly going to be altered in some way, shape, or form. And already we all have some of the players, some of the more notable players not taking part in it. I saw Christian McCaffrey probably not playing in the preseason. Kirk Cousins rumored to not be playing. Aaron Rodgers, same thing. Daniel Jones wants to play, but I'm not sure the Giants will grant him that, permission. But there's already teams, opting out of playing in the preseason. And with joint practices happening, consecutively for a couple of days, it pretty much brings that element of having the preseason in a way. Some of the refs already show up, so you kind of have some guidance and some rules integrated to some of these joint practices. And also, you can't really hold out some of your main guys. I mean, you could, but if you have consecutive days of joint practices, you're not going to hold out your quarterback or your wide receiver for 3 consecutive days. They're going to be able to compete against opposing teams and players. So I think that way it could be seen as a more positive view for joint practices to kind of step in here and maybe be an alternative for the preseason. You bring out those other competitive juices, trying to keep it in a controlled sort of scenario as best as you can. But I think having more competition out there could probably bring out the best in some of the guys that are trying to make the roster. You think of those guys that are trying to make it on special teams, trying to make it as the backup quarterback, the 4th receiver on some team's roster. If they get an opportunity to play against, their teammates, it is impressive, but it gets to a point where it almost becomes, the same thing over and over again. If you put them up against, I don't know, maybe another team's best corner, another team's, 2nd or 3rd best defender or something like that, and they impress you, I think that creates a whole nother dynamic for trying to evaluate players in different scenarios against guys that are really trying to beat them in a controlled, competitive environment. But that's what really got me thinking about this. Joint practices starting up, it gets chippy, it gets heated right away, right off the bat, and you'd ideally like to control that more if you're the NFL, but it happens, and you get to see better plays, I believe. You get the best out of some of your guys, and it almost seems like more so than the preseason, it seems like guys try a little bit harder in some of these. You see how hard they go in these practices, in joint practices with some of the main guys out there practicing. You get the best out of them. Iron sharpens iron is thrown around a lot. I think it could be something that isn't completely insane for the NFL to consider, having more joint practices more frequently, maybe for 3 days in a row or something like that. Some certain scenarios where it could happen in the NFL, I believe, could be a good thing, especially when you have teams in the same city, the Jets and the Giants, maybe with Buffalo also included in there. The 49ers and the Rams and the Chargers are already doing it. Teams in Texas with the Texans, the Cowboys. You have so many scenarios where it could be ideal scenario for these teams to happen. And I don't know. I think it could be pretty interesting also to see how it all plays out. Maybe they'll play around with it. It seems like something that it is increasing over the last few years. So it's something that teams are comfortable with, but again, you have to manage the negative side of it and trying to limit the amount of fights that break out. But I wouldn't be surprised if the NFL considers it come next offseason, where I think we're going to see a lot of these big changes coming to the schedules and whatnot. But that's what I think of it. Let me know what you guys think. Also, do you think I'm pretty crazy suggesting this as an alternative, or do you value the preseason a little bit more than the NFL? And I evidently do as well. Leave your guys' thoughts in the comment section of this week's episode. But with that being the case, we're going to head to another break, and we have 2 more segments to talk about to close out this show. Davante Adams giving some more input on the quarterback battle between Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, plus some news regarding the Washington Commanders. Jaden Daniels will start their first preseason game on Saturday. We're going to go into that decision to start Jaden Daniels and the Commanders still being pretty quiet on who their starting quarterback will be officially. Those 2 topics are coming up after this short break. We'll be right back.